Hello everybody. I wanted to do a comparison between two different cameras. One with my Nikon, my very favorite Nikon crop sensor camera, the D7200, along with my very favorite portrait lens. And that would be the Nikon 70-200 f2.8 lens. Outstanding. Camera's outstanding. The lens, spectacular. It's one of my favorite Nikon lenses. And I know the image quality that comes out of this is spectacular. So I wanted to do a comparison test of a good mirrorless system. And the mirrorless system I chose is made by Fuji. Now I've been a Fuji shooter since the beginning, since making the transition from film to memory cards many years ago. And I've used Fuji professionally, and I've also used Nikon professionally for portraits and for weddings. So I've been using both systems for quite a while now. And the camera I chose from Fuji would be the X-T10, very, very similar to the X-T1 without some of the bells and whistles. And I also wanted to choose a comparable lens to my 70-200 Nikon lens, and I chose the Fuji 50mm to 140mm f2.8 lens. These lenses are very comparable. So what I did was I drove all around, walked around, photographed many different things using these cameras side by side just to see how they compare in the shootout. So let's take a look at some of those images. So before I started photographing, I wanted to make sure that I set the camera controls pretty much identical, with the exception of the Fuji X-T10. I set the film simulation mode to Velvia. I like a little bit more saturation and contrast when doing outdoor photography like nature and that type of thing. And on a Nikon D7200, I set the picture control to vivid, also giving me a little bit more color saturation and contrast, so they match up pretty close. Now, even though we're comparing apples and oranges here, you can do that. I checked online, and as far as I know, it's still legal. You can compare apples and oranges, and that's what we're doing here. So, but anyway, the sensor size on these two cameras are almost identical. While the Fuji X-T10 has a 16 megapixel file, the Nikon D7200 yields a 24 megapixel file. And these file sizes are way adequate for most situations. So what I wanted to do in this particular shootout was to compare these two camera systems, not so much as far as the technical specs go, because you can find that stuff on Nikon and Fuji's website. Nobody knows that better than they do. But I wanted to see the image quality coming out of these two cameras. So number one, I was looking for the color as it comes out of these cameras, and also the sharpness with using these two lenses with these camera bodies. And then also I was looking at background blur, because these systems are going to be very useful when doing photography like portraits, whether it's family portraits, individual, high school seniors, and also very popular for wedding photography, whether it's candids or doing some portraits, and certainly sports photography. So that's why I was looking at the background blur, because many times when you do a portrait, you want to isolate the subject. So as I set out here, I came across some nice people, and I was able to take a few photographs of them. And on these two photographs here, I had my Fuji set to the widescreen setting, the 16:9, and you could see how it looks in a widescreen format. Now, one thing about the Fuji camera is that you do have that option of shooting widescreen, where in the Nikon, you really don't have that option in the menu. There's ways around it, but it's really not in the menu. So Fuji does give you more options as far as the different size formats. Now I wanted to do a side-by-side comparison. So as I came across a pan with some spoons hanging from a tree, I thought this would be a great thing to photograph, because it could show me the kind of color I'm going to get from the camera, and then also we can see some of the background blur. So I started with my Fuji X-T10, put the camera on the tripod, and for these, by the way, I was shooting on the outdoor ones. We were shooting auto white balance, and most of these were done using aperture priority. And as I mentioned, I have the Fuji set to film simulation Velvia mode. Okay, so here we're looking at, and this is done shooting wide open with the Fuji at f2.8. And I was zoomed in all the way to 140mm. And I set the ISO at 400. So here you can see we get nice natural color. We got some nice beautiful background blur. Actually, the images were both very, very sharp using these two lenses. And then switching to the Nikon D7200, I have both cameras again on the tripod. Here we're using the 70-200, also setting the lens to f2.8, again aperture priority, auto white balance, and then here again you can see just nice natural color. And notice here on a D7200 we get a little bit more of a background blur. And even at 2.8 we get some really nice sharpness with this lens. Now just to point out here, the Nikon D7200 that you're looking at here is f2.8, and on this one here now I switched it to f8. So you could see we're getting less, at f8 we're actually getting less background blur because at f8 it's a smaller lens opening, so we're getting a little bit more depth of field. Therefore, we're not getting a defocused background as much as if we were to shoot wide open at 2.8. And we're getting a little bit of background blur, but nothing near that we would be getting, that we got actually at f2.8. So just to keep that in mind, when you want to photograph something and you want to isolate the subject, you want to use a large lens opening, which would be a smaller number. However, when you do that, just understand, especially if you're going with some really fast lenses like 1.4s and 1.8s, you have to keep in mind that your focus has to be pretty much right on. And if your subject is moving, like if you're doing candids or sport things, you definitely want to take a lot of photographs because just a little bit of movement may cause your subject to be out of focus. And then with the Fuji X-T10, you can see that when we're shooting at f2.8, we get nice background blur. And then when we're shooting at f8, which would be a smaller lens opening, we're getting more depth of field, therefore we have less background blur. And then here I came across a nice area in the background that had some little specular highlights coming in through the leaves. And we started with the Nikon D7200. Again, I'm at f2.8. And ISO this time we took it up to 800. And as we come in a little bit closer, you can see we get beautiful image sharpness with this lens. And also notice that we have nice background blur, and here we can see the bokeh. People call it bokeh and some people call it bokeh, which is the pattern of the background, and then you can see that coming through here. And we have a nice diffused background here with the 7200. And as we switch to the Fuji X-T10, we still have nice background blur, not quite as much, but you can also see the bokeh or the bokeh, whatever, and you can see the difference. And we're shooting again at f2.8, and again we have these on auto white balance, so sometimes we can have a little bit variation depending on our focusing point. But this gives you an idea of the background blur and the bokeh that we're getting from this image. And coming up, we're going to be taking a look at a few images that were taken using a really high ISO. And as we take a look at these images, you can see the sharpness, and you can also see the neat grain pattern that we get by using this high ISO. And this also has maybe certain applications that you might want to use it for, so don't miss that.